The following sermon was preached at First Assembly of God, Wascom in Wascom, Texas. Thank you for stopping in. Please like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you are in the area, we would love for you to join us in worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and Wednesday at 6 p.m. May the Lord bless you and keep you.
We are continuing with our study in the Synoptic Gospels this evening. And we're going to start in Luke chapter 5, but we're also going to be reading from Mark chapter 1 and from Matthew chapter 4. So you can take your pick which passage you want to open to. Mark chapter 1, Matthew chapter 4, or Luke chapter 5. Because we are going to read all three of these passages. Over the last number of weeks, we've been talking about Jesus' early ministry. His early ministry. What he has been doing in the region of Galilee. So who can give us a very quick summary as to what we've talked about over the last number of weeks with the Lord's ministry in Galilee? Okay, so he has been healing. Yes, he has had a ministry of healing. Can you give us maybe one or two examples of that?
No.
Not off the top of your head. So one of the things he did was he went to Simon Peter's house, and Simon Peter's mother-in-law was sick with the fever, kind of like my own wife. And what did he do? He took her by the hand and he rebuked the fever, right? And what did she do? Yeah, she got up and started to serve. She got up and said, "What are all these people doing in my house? Are y'all hungry? You want something to drink?" And she got up and went right to work. This was an example of a miracle by Jesus. This wasn't a long, drawn-out recovery process. No, he touched her. She was sick and bedridden, and then she was delivered, and she was up and serving the next second. Completely restored, completely healed. Miracle of the Lord. And of course, as the word of that spread, the inhabitants, the people of the city, what did they do?
They started to gather around and follow him.
Yeah, they gathered around. They were looking for him. They brought the sick, the demon-possessed. They all gathered around. And what did Jesus do? He healed them all. He healed them all. He delivered them all from demonic oppression. And then, as our sister said, Jesus rose early in the morning. This is kind of where we left off. He rose early in the morning, went to be with the Father, to be restored and strengthened in prayer. All the people are looking for him. And who can remember what Jesus said when they said, "Hey, everyone's looking for you"? What was Jesus' response? We must preach. I've got more to do. I've got to preach the kingdom in all of these cities. I'd love to stay here in Capernaum and heal the sick all day, but I've got other things to do. I've got to preach this gospel in all of the other cities as well. And so that is where we left off. And what we're going to pick up on this evening is the kind of the next story here, which is the calling of the first disciples. The calling of the first disciples. And so we're going to be reading, like I say, from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because all three of them have this passage here. So let's start with Mark chapter 1. Whoever's in Mark, let's start in Mark chapter 1 and read verses 16 through 20.
Now as he walked by the sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And Jesus said unto them, "Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men." And straightway they forsook their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little further thence, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets. And straightway he called them. And they left their father, Zebedee, in the ship with the hired servants and went after him. And they went to Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught.
Okay. Okay, now whoever's in Matthew, let's read Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22. Verses 18 through 22 of Matthew chapter 4.
And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him.
Okay, so here we have two stories, one from Mark, one from Matthew, and those two stories are basically identical. The same exact story of the calling of Simon called Peter, his brother Andrew, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They're fishing, and he calls them, and they leave everything and they follow him. Well, just like how we saw when we began talking about Jesus' early ministry, how Matthew and Mark had a very short summary of his ministry, and then we looked at the Gospel of Luke, and Luke kind of expanded on that a little bit. We have the same thing here this evening. So let's look now at Luke chapter 5, and let's read verses 1 through 3. If someone will read verse 1 through 3, we're going to break this one up because it's much longer.
And it came to pass that as the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God, he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, and saw two ships standing by the lake. But the fishermen were gone out of them, and were washing their nets. And he entered into one of the ships, which was Simon's, and prayed him that he would thrust out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people out of the ship. That's it, right?
Yeah, that's good. Now if someone will read verse 4 and 5. If someone will read verse 4 and 5.
When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your net for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all day or all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net."
Okay, so at this point in the story, we kind of see what's going on. They're here. They're by the lake of Gennesaret, as it were, which is just another name for the Sea of Galilee. So they're by the Sea of Galilee, and we see that Jesus is teaching a crowd of people. We see these fishermen working their nets, one of whom was Simon Peter. Jesus said, "Hey, let me get into this boat and go out a little bit so he can teach the people." And so he does so. And then, of course, when he was done, he says, "Hey, Peter, why don't you let your net down and see if you can catch some fish?" And what's Peter's response to that?
And fished all night. Caught nothing.
Yeah, look, man, look, Jesus, look. You're a carpenter, and I appreciate that, but I'm a fisherman, okay? And I've been fishing all night long, and there ain't no fish to be caught, okay? I'm cleaning my net. Look, and it's something to know about here is on the Sea of Galilee, fishing was a great enterprise. And most of the fishing, almost all of the fishing, takes place at night. Because at night, when the air is cool, the fish will come to the surface of the water. It's really the same, I think most fishermen will tell you. But during the day, when it's hot, the fish go deep and they're trying to stay cool. And you just didn't fish during the day. It's not something that happened. All the fishing was done at night. So now it's the day, and they're cleaning their nets. They're getting ready for the next night of fishing. And Jesus says, "Hey, I know it's daytime, and I know you've been fishing all night, but hey, go ahead and let your net down." And Peter's like, "Bro, I don't want to, what are you talking about? Let my nets down. Like, we were just fishing. There's nothing there." He says, "Nevertheless," I guess he figured he kind of owed him one. I mean, he did heal his mother-in-law after all. So I guess he figured maybe I owe you one. If you insist, if you say, I will let down the net. And let's continue our story. Let's read verse 6 through 9.
And when they had this done, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. And they beckoned unto their partners, which were on the other ship, that they should come and help them. And they came and filled both ships, so that they began to sink. And Simon Peter saw it. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he was astonished at all that were with him, at the draught of fishes which they had taken.
Okay, so he did it. He did what Jesus said. And what happened?
Filled up both ships.
Filled up both ships. Caught so many fish that it was breaking the nets, right? This huge multitude of fish. He caught so much so he had to call over his partners. They're loading up the ships, and the ships were so full that they began to sink. And then how did Simon Peter respond to this?
He didn't think he was worthy of it. He's a sinful man. He just don't know what I've done.
Yep.
I'm not worthy of this.
That's right. He falls down at the knees of the Lord and says, Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. Much like the prophet Isaiah, when he is revealed the glory of God in Isaiah chapter 6. And Isaiah says, at that vision that he has, what does he say? I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell amongst the people of unclean lips. And just like the Lord loosed an angel with a hot coal to purify the mouth of Isaiah, how does Jesus respond to Simon Peter? Well, I guess we haven't read that yet.
I got that.
We haven't got that far yet. But yeah, so Simon has the miraculous catch. He's astonished. He falls down. Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. You don't know what I've done. You don't understand the life that I've lived. For he was astonished at all of the fish that they had taken. Now let's go ahead and finish it, verses 10 and 11.
And so, go ahead.
And so also were James and John, the son of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed them.
Okay, so he says, Depart from me, I'm a sinful man. And how does the Lord respond to this? Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. From now on, what is Peter going to do? He's going to catch men. You were a fisherman, Peter, but now you're going to be a fisher of men, right? You are going to be a fisher of men, a catcher of men. Do not be afraid. Similar to how, once again, the Lord dispatched an angel. The angel purified the mouth of Isaiah. Even so, the Lord now is calling and commissioning Simon to be a fisher of men. And it says that they brought their ships to the land, and what did they all do? They dropped everything, they forsook all, and they followed the Lord Jesus. So in all three of these stories now, we have kind of the setting. We've read the stories, we've walked through them. Who are the main characters here in this story? Jesus, Simon Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John. So we've got Jesus and we've got these four disciples, these four apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Now, before we get too much further into this, I do want to say a brief word about chronology real quick. Chronology, which is like a sequence of events. So what our goal as we're studying these Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, our goal is to work through them chronologically. We want to follow Jesus' life and ministry from beginning to end. There's a little bit of a problem with that, though. And the problem that we're presented with as we're doing that is that you might notice that in the Gospels, not everything exactly lines up in the same exact chronological order. Sometimes it's kind of hard to find the exact chronological order in the Gospels. And so that kind of presents us with a problem. For instance, the passage that we read from Mark, that passage takes place before the ministry in Galilee that we were talking about over the previous weeks. So if you look at Mark verses 16 through 20, which is the calling of these disciples, in the story of Mark, that happens before all of the healing and the delivering on the Sabbath and everything that Jesus is doing as he is ministering in Galilee that we talked about over the last couple of weeks. The calling of these disciples takes place before that. And the same is true in Matthew, where it talks about the calling of the disciples before it talks about Jesus and the things that he goes on to do. But what we see in Luke is that Jesus is ministering in Galilee. He's delivering demoniacs. He's healing the sick. And then it talks about how he calls these disciples. And this is confounded even more when we go and we look at John chapter 1 and verses 35 through 50, and we see Jesus interacting with Andrew and Simon and Philip and Nathanael. They're at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, right after his baptism in John chapter 1. We have stories there of Jesus calling different disciples, and it's not even the same 4 disciples. So there is something of a problem when we're trying to work through the Bible, in the New Testament specifically, chronologically. It can be very difficult to do. But there's good reasons for this. We should not be worried about this. Because the truth is that ancient writers, ancient history in general, is not nearly concerned with strict chronology as we are. You understand what I'm saying? Ancient history is not nearly as worried about listing events that happened 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, going down through the story. That's really not how ancient historians approached it. It's particularly when we think about what the Gospels are from like a literature context. What you could describe the Gospels are, they are unique, but Gospels are basically ancient biographies, right? This is a biography of the life of Jesus. And if you read other ancient biographies, maybe written by Plutarch or somebody like that, what you will find is that a guy like Plutarch, who wrote ancient biography, he's not necessarily concerned with listing the events of somebody's life. Well, first they were a kid, and when they were 10, they did this. And when they were 15, they did this. And when they were 25, they did this. That's really not how it works. They're not as concerned with moving chronologically through a story in the same way that we are concerned about it. The ancients just had a very different approach to writing history. They had a very different approach to the way that they did things. And so for us, to try to take our idea of how history should be written and impose that upon people who lived thousands of years ago, that's just a bad way to do history. That's called anachronism, okay? An anachronism is a bad way to do history because the people who lived in the past were not us. They didn't think like us. They didn't have the same values as us. They did not have the same priorities as we do. We cannot take our priorities and impose them upon previous generations. We just can't do that. That's called anachronism. That's why it's so silly when people look back on the founding fathers and the founding generations of America and say, well, those people are all evil because they had slaves. That's called anachronism. That's a very bad way of thinking about history. They lived in a different generation. They had different values. They had different priorities. They did things differently. And we can never actually learn from history if we refuse to set aside our own modern prejudices and try to approach it from the position that they're coming from. You understand what I mean by that? We cannot read history in this way. And when we are reading the Gospels, yes, it is more than history, but it's not any less than that. Because what we are reading is history. And so we have to try to lay aside our modern prejudice. We have to try to lay aside our modern expectations in the way that we do things as modern people and try to understand what's happening here from the perspective of those who were there, from the perspective of those who are recording these events. So the chronology was not as important to them as it is to us. Nevertheless, we can work out a pretty decent chronology. Now, think about Matthew for a moment. I would say that Luke is probably the most chronologically accurate of all the Gospels, and Matthew is the least. Think about the structure of Matthew. Matthew begins with Jesus' birth and early life, and then it goes into a section on his teachings, where we have the Sermon on the Mount and a whole big group of his teachings. And then it goes into a section of his miracles in his life. And then it goes into a section on his parables and everything there. And then the end of the book is all about the end of his life, his death, burial, and resurrection, right? So it is loosely in chronological order. But as we will see when we get deeper into this study, we're going to be in like Luke chapter 5 and at the same time reading passages from Matthew chapter 9. And then we'll be in like Luke chapter 18 reading passages from Matthew chapter 6 or something. You know what I mean? Like Matthew is not concerned with chronology at all. That's just not the way he structured his gospel. But Luke, I think, is the most chronological. And I think he did it on purpose. Let's look at Luke chapter 1 for a moment. This is why, for our purposes here, as we're going through this study, our default gospel, when it comes to the sequence of events, our default gospel is going to be Luke. And wherever there is a difference in order of events, I'm just assuming that Luke is the chronological one. Okay? This is just an assumption that I'm bringing to the table. And the reason why is because of what we're fixing to read. Let's look at this again. Luke chapter 1, and let's read verse 3 and 4.
It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed.
Okay, so what is Luke's intention as he is writing his gospel? I want you to understand all things in order, from the very beginning, in order. And we see that Luke writes his gospel, and then he doesn't stop there. He goes on, and what else does Luke write? The book of Acts. So Luke's story begins with the early life of Jesus, goes all the way through his ministry, and then picks up in the book of Acts and talks about everything the apostles did up until the imprisonment of Paul in Rome. So this is what Luke's intention is. He is trying to set out the life and ministry of Jesus in order. So for our purposes, what we're doing as we study through the Gospels, our default gospel, when it comes to the order of events, is going to be Luke. Okay? But it still leaves us now with this question, though, about the call of the disciples. This is the first time we've really encountered this issue of chronology so far in our study. And so it still leaves us with the question of how do we account for, even if we bring John into this, how do we account for kind of this different order of events? Does anyone have any ideas on how we may account for this? Why does there appear to be a different sequence of events? Why does it appear that Jesus is calling in the Synoptics these four people, but when we look at John, we see a little bit of a different story and much different timing. Much different timing. And I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer. This might not be something we've ever really thought about before, so I'm asking you to start to think about these kinds of things.
A different viewpoint.
Okay?
Well, I'm thinking that Matthew was mainly writing to the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Mark was concerned about all the miracles.
Mm-hmm.
He was a miracle guy. He started off with miracles.
Writing to the Roman people who valued that kind of thing.
And Luke was tying the Jews into the Gentiles. And that's just different. Gentiles had a totally different viewpoint than Jewish people.
And he thought if he didn't explain it to them in a way that was in depth, they wouldn't understand it. Because of the different way they saw things.
The different viewpoints, the different intentions of the gospel authors.
Different philosophy.
Different philosophies. They're communicating the same message, but I think we talked about this last week, sometimes we can tell the same exact story to two different audiences, and we're going to tailor the way we tell the story
That's right.
based on the audience. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just a way that people communicate. And so, yeah, that's how we can account for some of these differences. They have different intentions, different viewpoints. One of the things that I think when I think about this is, it's never really a good idea to try to take things in the Bible and put them in opposition to one another. I always try to do what's called harmonizing things. I don't want to pit these things against each other. I want to kind of mesh them together and harmonize. And I think one takeaway we can have from this is this idea of a progressive commitment. I don't suppose that the very first interaction that Jesus had with Simon Peter was here in his boat when he called him to be a disciple. Think about it in your own life. Before you became a committed believer, can you not look back over your life and see various moments in time where the Lord was beckoning you to himself? And then you go on a little bit of time and the Lord is beckoning you to himself. And then there comes a certain point in your life where you forsake all and follow him. Is it so far-fetched to suppose that Jesus, in the months leading up to this story where the fish are all caught, is it too far-fetched to suppose that Jesus had actually called these men to himself on more than one occasion? Can that not be? Does the Lord just give us one opportunity, and then if we don't forsake all and follow him, that's it? Sorry, someone else took your spot? Not exactly, right? So it's not so. I think that there's an idea of a progressive commitment on the part of Simon, on the part of Andrew, on the part of these disciples. Just like in our lives, we are progressively more and more committed to the Lord until eventually, for all of us, there comes a point where we forsake all and follow him, right? But for most people, it doesn't just happen like that. You're not confronted by a street preacher going along your day, living in the world, and then one day you hear a street preacher say something, and bam, that's it. You're a Christian now. That's not very frequent that happens. That kind of thing, sure, it happens, but it's kind of rare. I think for most of us, we can describe our conversion experience as being something of a process, where the Lord is taking us one step at a time.
Some of us longer than others.
Some of us longer than others, until we come to a point where we are forsaking all, where like Peter we say, Lord, depart from me. We recognize the holiness of God, we recognize our sin, we recognize that Jesus is calling us to himself, and we forsake all and follow him. And not only is there an element of a progressive commitment, but I think we also see on the part of Jesus a persistent calling. A persistent calling. Jesus doesn't give up on these men just because they didn't forsake all the first time he ever called them. The first time they ever saw him, the first time he ever met them, and he said, hey, come and follow me. He didn't just give up on them because they didn't leave their business behind. He didn't just give up on them because they didn't leave their family tradition behind. He didn't just give up. He had a persistent calling. He kept coming to them. Hey, follow me. Yeah. And aren't we so glad he does that with us?
He didn't gather all of them at the same time, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it ain't like you walk down the seashore and just pluck them out.
Right. Right.
There were people that followed him and all the wonderful things that he had already done. So that spread like rumors in a small town.
Uh-huh.
And so they would have gotten a taste of that also. And of course, Simon, his mother-in-law, firsthand, and he was preaching in synagogues. And so the men of the city would be hearing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it was puzzle pieces that came together just in the right way, as Jesus will do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think these are all really good thoughts on how to put this together. Once again, there's no need to put these things in opposition to one another. I think that's why we have the 4 accounts, because the 4 accounts give us the full picture. We wouldn't have the full picture if we only had Luke. We wouldn't have the full picture if we only had John. But when we take all of them and put them together, it really does give us that full picture. And I don't think it's outrageous to suppose that Jesus is calling these men to himself on more than one occasion. I don't think it's outrageous to suppose a situation like that. Obviously, he had some relation with Simon already. He was in Simon's house on the Sabbath, eating Sabbath dinner, healing his mother-in-law. So there was some relation already there. And it was, of course, at this point where he truly called him to himself. Peter, coming to the end of himself, commits everything to following the Lord. He, as it says, forsakes all and follows him, which really transitions us very well into this next point, which is about Jesus' call to radical discipleship. Jesus' call to radical discipleship. When Jesus calls these men, what is it that he says to them? Come and follow me. Come and follow me. Yeah, I know you have a business. Come and follow me. Yeah, I know you have a family. Come and follow me. Yeah, I know you have a nice, cozy life here in Capernaum. Come and follow me. And the disciples understood what he was requesting of them, because what is it that they did? How does it describe what the disciples did at that point?
Left their livelihood.
They left it all behind.
The father, head of the household, the father. Left
You know-
him, left everything that they knew for something of uncertain. So,
You don't talk someone into doing that just like the first time you ever met them.
Yeah. And especially if you're just like some random crazy fella preaching about the end of the world, right? Like, what would you, if you went down to the park and you saw some guy preaching about the end of the world and how he was the savior of the world, and he said, come and follow me. I mean, I don't think many of us would be very eager to forsake our businesses and follow after this guy, right? And of course we say, oh, yeah, but that's different. But is it really all that different? Is it really all that different? Of course, when I can't imagine what it would have been like to actually be in the presence of Jesus, the Messiah, God in flesh. Obviously, there was something unique about him. We already saw it. He taught as one who had authority. He taught as everyone was astonished at the things he said. So yes, it is different, but at the same time, it's actually a very similar comparison. Like, here's this guy, just some guy. Yeah, he's a gifted teacher. Yeah, okay. But he's calling me to leave everything. My family business, my father, my lifestyle. I mean, these guys were fishermen. I'm sure that from the time they were young, they were raised to do this. This was at least a 2-generation fishing business, if not more. I don't know who was the father of Zebedee. I don't know. This could have been the family thing for generations.
But think about this. They have been waiting all their lives for this Messiah
Yeah.
to come. And I'm sure it was a little bit of a shocker when he first showed up, and it took a little bit of persuasion, but they've been waiting on this man all their life.
Yeah.
They knew he was coming. So, I mean, the guy at the park, he ain't been waiting on him.
We ain't been waiting on him. That's true. We ain't been waiting on him.
witnessing the miracles firsthand also, they play a part in it with the mother-in-law and then the fish. Because they knew there weren't any fish there to be found.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, so let's talk about the fish for a second. This is a very good point. So they're out here, and these men they're fishermen, right? And they just caught like $1 million load. Like, this is the mother load. This was a big enough catch for them that, I mean, they could have retired. They could have doubled their business. This was the $1 million catch, the miraculous catch. And it was at this point where Jesus calls them to forsake all and follow him. And we've already talked about it. That's their business. It's their livelihood. It's the only thing they've ever known. It's their family. Simon Peter had a family. He had a wife, all these things. And they are called to forsake all of that. And Jesus calls them, it's so interesting because when he calls them to follow all, he's not really asking them to step down, is he?
No.
Because he's actually calling them to something higher. He says, you guys are fishermen, but what? If you follow me, what's going to happen?
Make you fish.
you'll be fishers of men. How much more valuable is a man than a fish? How much more valuable is a man than a fish? Jesus is not calling them to step down from anything. He's calling them to something higher. He's saying, you've got this skill. You've got this thing. You've got your whole life. You've been trained and prepared to do this thing. And now, gentlemen, you are going to use these callings. You're going to use these gifts. You're going to use this experience you have for my kingdom. And what you're going to be catching is so much more valuable even than this $1 million catch. Yeah, I got a couple fish right here. I can make the fish appear. What does that matter? You're going to be fishers of men. You were fishermen, but now you're going to be fishers of men. He's calling them to something so much higher, such a greater value. And the truth is, when Jesus calls us in the same way, He is calling us to something so much greater. When He calls us to forsake all and follow Him, He's calling us to something much higher than what we have. Now, here's the question, though. When Jesus calls us to follow Him and to forsake all and follow Him, as it were, how does that look? Does that mean that every single one of us, when we become believers, we have to sell our houses and all our possessions and go and wander as street missionaries or something? Because, that's what these guys did. And that was the radical call to discipleship that they received. Jesus is calling us to follow Him today. So what does that look like?
I think certain sacrifices have to be made. And your idea of what your life should be instead of what your life could be.
That's very good. So, for example, you've got these men here, and they're fishermen, and they thought, this is what I'm going to do. They had plans, they had ambitions, they had things that had to do with fish, no doubt. And when Jesus calls them to follow Him, what did they have to do? They had to forsake all of that. They had to forsake their own ideas for what lies in their future. And I think even today for us, we may not be called to quit our jobs and to sell our possessions and do all of that, but we are definitely called to surrender our future to Him, right? We may not be called to sell all of our possessions and move to a foreign country as a missionary, but at the same time, maybe we will be.
The missionaries, they're not supposed to owe any bills. They're not even supposed to have a mortgage on a house. When they go over there, they don't have any debt. And they go over there and they live like the people that they're ministering to. It's like that is the calling that a lot of us, would be willing to give up everything in this country, our lifestyle and everything, to go live in a different country and live the way the people live.
Yeah, and at the same time, though, let's think about this for a moment. When Jesus calls us to follow Him, are we not called to reject the ways of the world and to submit to Christ as Lord and His law and what He expects of us? And does that not require a great measure of sacrifice on the part of every Christian, whether you live in the United States of America or Zimbabwe? It doesn't really matter, does it? Because as believers, even in the West, if we are following Jesus, if we are living lifestyles submitted to the lordship of Christ, we're going to have to sacrifice. We can't live like the neighbors live. We can't value what the neighbors value. We can't think the way that the neighbors think. Because we're not really like them, are we? We have to forsake all that. We have to forsake our ideas of comfort. We have to forsake our ideas of what we want. We have to forsake the idea that we are the little kings and our castles made of sand. And we have to become slaves of Christ. We are called to forsake all and follow Him. We are called to a radical discipleship. We are called to leave these things, to leave behind the ways of the world in favor of the ways of Christ. Now that looks different for everybody, though, right? Of course it looks different for everybody, but it's very hard for us to imagine, because the truth is, in our society, it doesn't cost us very much. That's changing. That's changing very rapidly. And today it will cost you much more than it cost you 50 years ago. But the reality is, even so, today it doesn't cost us a whole lot to follow Jesus, does it? I'm reminded of what Jesus said. If you do not love me more than your father and mother and brother and sister, you're not worthy of me.
That's right.
If you're not willing to forsake all these things, then you have no part in my kingdom. If you don't value me above all these things, then that's very difficult for us to wrap our minds around. But I want you to think about it from a different perspective for a moment. Imagine that you are a young girl living in Iran, and Jesus calls you to follow him. That's going to cost you something. And then the words of Jesus, if you love your brothers or your mother or your father more than me, you're not worthy of me. That's when that really comes alive, doesn't it? Because that little girl in Iran, if she follows Christ, it's going to cost her. Best case scenario, she's going to be ousted from the community, forsaken by her family, completely shunned. Worst case scenario, she'll be publicly executed. And at that point, the words of Jesus really come alive, don't they? If you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. If you love your family ties, if you value your family ties more than your relationship with me, then you're not worthy of me. That comes alive when we think about it and the sacrifices that people have to make for the sake of Christ. But of course, does that mean that when we become Christians that we need to mistreat our family and shun them and treat them poorly or whatever? Of course not, right? Because Scripture commands us to live a certain way in the context of our family. And when we follow Christ, we're submitting to Him as our King. We're submitting to Him as our Lord. We are taking our lives and bringing it into subjection to His will. And that does cost us. We have to balance these things out. Jesus is calling all of us, and this is kind of, I'll wrap up at this point, and we'll continue on next week, Lord willing, but Jesus is calling all of us to a very real and very radical discipleship. In a sense, He is calling us to forsake all. And I'm not talking about your material possessions, but are we going to submit our material possessions to the Lordship of Christ? Are we going to submit the way we run our businesses to the Lordship of Christ? Are we going to submit the way that we spend our money to the Lordship of Christ? Are we going to submit the way that we raise our family to the Lordship of Christ? Are we going to submit the way we run a church to the Lordship of Christ? Because we're called to forsake our own ideas, to forsake our own ways, our own ambitions, and to follow after Him. And the call is just as real today as it was then. Any other thoughts about that as we kind of wrap this up this evening? Anyone else have any other thoughts?
It's kind of like when the rich young ruler came to him. First he called him good master. God, and Jesus told him, said, ain't one but good, that's God. Then he called him rabbi. So he didn't ever commit that Jesus was who he was. Mm-hmm. That's the first step to salvation, accepting Jesus Christ as who He is. Mm-hmm. And the further you get into contact or relationship, I say that if you have religion, you got the wrong thing. You need a relationship with Jesus Christ, and that relationship grows. Don't ever think you're at the end of it, because as long as you're breathing, you're going to be going one of two directions.
Very true.
If you go with the flow, you're going downstream. If you go with Jesus, you're going the right way. But everybody said, well, he wasn't willing to give up everything and follow Christ. No, he wasn't willing to accept Jesus as who He said He was.
Absolutely.
What am I trying to say, Charlie? You swimming upstream? You swimming upstream?
If you're following Jesus,
Yeah.
you're going upstream.
Yeah.
And of course, that story ends with that young man walking away sad.
And Jesus sad because he walked away.
Mm-hmm. That's how it goes. And that's a very good insight. You know, the problem wasn't necessarily that he wouldn't part with his possessions. Jesus called him to forsake all these things. And I'm like Charlie, I don't think it really was about the possessions. It was about the fact that those possessions possessed him.
That's right.
And his problem wasn't necessarily that he wouldn't part with those things. His problem occurred much earlier than that. And that he would not acknowledge who Christ was.
That's right.
He wouldn't acknowledge. He wanted the benefits of Christ. He wanted to inherit eternal life. But he didn't want to acknowledge Christ for who he was. He didn't want to follow after Christ. He didn't want to do the things that Christ called him to do. He wanted heaven without the cross. He wanted the resurrection without the cross, you could say. So, very good. Any other thoughts? Any other insights here? Well, praise the Lord. We're going to come back, Lord willing, next week and pick up and finish this out. But, Brother Wendell, will you close us in prayer?
Thank you for listening. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with a friend.